Welcome to Architects for Change, the podcast that bridges the gap between architecture, the built environment, and politics. I'm Jay Morton, your host. I'm an architect and political geek, and together we'll hear from the change makers and thought leaders who are shaping the future of our cities and spaces. Our conversations will tackle pressing questions that hold the key to our future. How can we achieve a net zero future? What does it truly take to design a better world? And most importantly, how can politics play a pivotal role in breaking down the barriers that hinder progress? Welcome to Architects for Change. Today I am joined by Gary McLuskey, who is Global Head of Design for Greystar. And Greystar are a developer that predominantly do housing, particularly build to rent and co-living across the world, but including the UK. And one of the sites that they're working on at the moment is quite close to me. I'm in New Cross, but we have the site at the Biscuit Factory in Bermondsey. So there's a lot going on. And I think it's good to talk to Gary because he's quite vocal about the challenges in terms of development, and obviously has a lot of knowledge and a global perspective as well. So it should be an interesting conversation. So welcome, Gary. Thank you for
Hi,
joining me
Jay.
from Madrid.
Yes, I'm in Madrid at the moment. Yeah, great to be on the podcast.
Brilliant, thank you. So maybe let's start with your journey. Obviously, you started out as an architect and now you've moved into development. So how did you make that change and how did you start?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a long journey. I guess I've been an architect now for 30 years. And the first 10 years I'd spent working on social housing projects.
Mm-hmm.
The second 10 years I spent on for sale development with a lot of different for sale developers. And the last 10 years I've been working in sort of build to rent. Um, and I've been with Greystar for the last 10 years. And I suppose, you know, it's not that I've switched from being an architect to a developer. I'm still an architect working within Greystar
Mm-hmm.
because we run our own internal design group within Greystar. So it's sort of, I'm probably doing more design now working with Greystar than what I did before, so when I was running an architect's office.
Do you feel you actually have more control over design and output on that side of the table?
Yeah, well, it's always a discussion, it's always a debate. And I think if you're a client, then you need to be in a position where you can talk intelligently about design with the designers. And so it's always good for clients, development clients, to have um, design sort of leaders within their business. And obviously, it helps with the dialogue with the architects, interior designers, and the consultant team. But it also helps internally, in terms of, talking about how we define what good quality is and what value is,
Mm-hmm.
and how we kind of manage costs and program and everything else. And so, it's an interesting role.
Excellent. Excellent. And then from what kind of projects are you actually working on at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, my group sort of looks after all of the international projects,
Mhm, mhm,
and we're there's sort of two roles that we do. One is we work with the local architects and local
mhm,
teams to kind of make sure that the design is the right sort of quality
mhm,
for what we're looking for. And then the other role is to kind of develop new product for the team.
mhm, mhm,
And so we'll go into a city like, Madrid. We'll look at the housing in Madrid, and then we'll sort of match that with our research into what residents want. And
mhm,
so we'll develop that a set of apartment plans and building typologies that the local architects can use as a starting point. And I think that's critical. It's sort of when I joined Greystar, it was sort of left up to, each local group and architect to go sort of figure it out themselves.
mhm,
And then you kind of lose a bit of the knowledge across the business. And
mhm,
so our group, working with all of these people in all these different countries, we're kind of sharing best practice across the whole business.
mhm,
And then we're also kind of challenging maybe convention and policy within each country, because every country has its own, you know, policy constraints,
Yeah.
and issues. And so we can kind of, look across countries and actually see where, certain policies just really don't make sense, and help the teams kind of build an argument around that. Um,
You can
so,
kind of
so
share knowledge across countries, but also best practice, so you're not reinventing the wheel every time.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I
Mhm.
mean, we have over 2 million residents,
Mhm.
and
Wow.
we've got a whole research team,
Mhm.
who are dedicated to asking those residents what they want.
Mhm.
Um, and if you ask the residents what you want and you look at the responses of the research team, it has no correlation to what policy is trying to deliver, you know. And I think that's where the fundamental disconnect is. I think we're in a very lucky position that we've got such a base, to focus our research on, and that feedback can play into how we're delivering the projects. Because
Yeah.
the fundamental basis of built to rent in particular is that it's a long-term investment. And so it has to be successful on day one as day 200, 300, 20 years time. And so the whole business is predicated on the idea that, you know, you will deliver, stable returns for your investors by creating a successful community. And that's where, it's not sort of get in, get out quickly,
Yeah.
move on to the next one. It's actually, it's predicated on understanding what makes communities successful and then driving those, through the design process.
And would you say, because you have been quite vocal about regulation, and as you mentioned, there's different regulations across different countries, so you've actually
Yeah.
got that global perspective. And do you think there is sometimes friction against what your data says makes a good community and a good place to what some of the regulations are sort of forcing you to do?
Yeah, I mean, here's the interesting thing. It's like if I took all the policies from every country and I put them all together,
Yeah.
you would think that you would find some universal truth, and there
Yeah.
isn't,
Yeah.
you know? There isn't, and so what that tells me is actually there is no universal truth, and all of these things are really kind of, you know, I like to say sort of made up, um, you know?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if you looked at Shoreditch and you said, Shoreditch doesn't have any of the policies of what constitutes amazing placemaking,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's an incredible place, It's a lively place, it's got energy. And I think what's missing, and it's been missing for a long time, is the connection between design and space and the people who occupy it, you know, the people who manage it. And I think it's the people that make the place, not the architecture, and so for every design guidance that is trying to kind of constrain designers into one way of thinking, you can always find a successful exception that doesn't follow any of that guidance.
Yeah.
So the thing that drives me crazy is the idea that, maybe in 2005, someone wrote a guidance document for housing in London. They said in that document, "Oh, this is just a guidance document, don't use it as policy." And 20 years later, we're faced with this being policy, and it's a blunt instrument, it's an incredibly blunt instrument because you just can't capture all of the nuances of context and, the way people behave and the way things change in one sort of document that was written 20 years ago. Um,
Yeah.
and it, and the funny thing is, with the London Housing Design Guide, which is the classic, that was copied in Ireland and then it was copied in Australia. And so the problem gets compounded, and it becomes easy for administrations to kind of, "Oh, we don't wanna have to think about that, so let's just make
Yeah.
it policy." So we did a survey recently. I mean, this is a classic.
Yeah.
We always get this, question in Australia, Ireland, and, UK. Never anywhere else in the world, never anywhere else, is
Right.
north-facing apartments, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so we did a survey, of around 1,000 renters, not our renters, external renters, people who are renting in the market, in the southeast of England. from a broad range of income levels, very broad. Um, and the crazy thing was that people were given the choice, what is your preference?
Yeah.
North, east, south, or west facing apartments? 16% in the total target audience chose north facing,
Interesting.
above east, above west, and above
Wow.
south.
Yeah.
That rises to 27% when you get into the higher income levels, you know.
Okay. Yeah.
And so the blunt instrument that the government has is like no one is allowed to have north facing apartments.
I mean,
I
interesting.
mean,
This is
it's
my favorite
madness.
room in the house, and this is north.
Yeah.
I
I
actually
mean,
quite like the light quality that comes in. I mean, you can have bigger windows, you can see the
it
garden.
is it has the softest light quality
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
any room in the house. It never overheats, you
Yeah.
know. You get to look out at the sun,
Yeah. Yeah.
they're reflecting off all the trees and the buildings outside, and
Yeah.
so this is what drives me nuts is you have someone sitting in a room saying north facing is bad, and then, 27% of our target market would rather have north facing over any other orientation. And
Yeah.
the crazy thing is the least popular is west facing. So if we were really kind of driving, design decisions with data, then
Yeah.
we would be trying to ban west facing apartments, which is ridiculous as trying to ban north facing apartments. And the problem is that, you know, it becomes a tick box exercise. And when
Yeah.
it becomes a tick box exercise, then it becomes really sort of, the planners become intransigent. It's
Mm.
impossible to kind of move them.
And I
And
suppose, like you say, it means that the people who are on the other side reviewing a scheme, deciding whether it gets planning or not, or if they're a councillor on the planning committee trying to decide if something's good or not,
yeah,
in a way, the tick box is the easy way for them to decide if it's good
exactly.
or not, but
Yeah.
actually, otherwise you need to think differently. And I think I do agree with you. It does stifle creativity of like testing different ways of maybe living
Yeah.
and alternative layouts or
But no, I mean, it's just the whole idea that, you can take a very blunt instrument and determine the future of how people want to live, just by a couple of people sitting in a room and making that decision,
yeah,
rather than going out and talking to people and gathering the data and understanding in a level of depth that, maybe some people just don't look at, is crazy. And there's a real impact to it. So we did a density study in Australia.
yeah,
We took the Australian regulations, which are even more draconian. They've sort of become fixated on cross ventilation,
right,
um, and we did an exercise where if we designed a building, which is a type of building that's been designed for the last 4,000 years, an urban block, which probably originated back, 2000 BC, um, and, has been successful all the way through history until the last 20 years, where it's no longer acceptable. If we design a building like that, and then we apply the regulations to that block, there's a 30% density loss.
right,
So site that
yeah.
site could have yielded 30% more units. And so what's happening is that,
And those
because there
units are homes
and those
at some
units are
point.
homes,
Yeah,
and so what's happening is like there's increased pressure to go up. And
yeah,
so in Australia, there's a massive pressure to go higher because they're trying to overcome all of these restrictions. And so the low-rise urban block is no longer a model that can be used for all of these regulations. And it's been used for the last 4,000 years. And
yeah,
in the last 20 years, it's being prohibited only in the UK, Australia, and Ireland, right?
yeah.
And so we did some research last year to understand, what was our best performing assets. Our low-rise buildings outperform our high-rise.
Okay, and for what are the reasons for that?
People
Yeah,
want to live in communities with,
yeah,
up to maybe six-story development where you can look out your window and see the street and connect to
and
people
still
rather
almost
than
see
being
someone's face.
isolated. Yeah, rather than being
Yeah,
totally isolated in a tower looking out across the city. No, look, it's horses for courses. I mean, I would say yes, towers are good in a certain sense, but the data suggests actually the preference is actually for low rise. And I was on a conference. It was a London Sydney conference, and everyone was talking about, oh yeah, we need to build higher density. We need to build higher. Everyone was talking about it, and I just kind of said, well, hang on a minute. Has anybody asked the people who are going to live there?
yeah. I
Nobody
mean,
asked.
yeah, I'm also the thing about, we're working this a lot, actually testing the space between buildings because actually a lot of that sort
Uh-huh.
of UK planning regulation of 22 meters is
Mm.
actually quite a non-human scale, and all the streets and places
Oh,
that
yeah.
we all love when we go around Europe or, in the UK as well, it is that
Yeah.
we like the narrower streets, the sort of human scale where you can possibly see someone, and actually
Yeah.
maybe we need to get over the risk of being looked at, but
Yeah.
actually, you can then increase density. It's also quite good for overheating as well, if you've got narrow in the hot spaces that, narrower streets, particularly I would imagine where you are in Madrid right now.
Yeah.
So, and again, you can still go lower and get more homes in if
Yeah. I
you're
mean,
not stuck with this
there's
22 meters.
yeah, there's definitely, intimate streets are
Yeah,
incredible and they
yeah,
exist all over the world and they're very successful all over
and
the world.
everyone takes photos and puts
You
them
come
on Instagram.
You come to Madrid and you go to Salamanca, the average street width there is probably like 12 meters
Yeah,
between
yeah,
buildings. It's the most expensive neighborhood in the entire city. And in some sense, it's sort of like someone wrote that guidance when they were talking about new towns in the 1950s. 22 meters was the kind of the distance that you couldn't quite make out the detail of someone if you saw
yeah.
them naked. So,
It is the distance
that
you
was
can't
the
see a nipple, isn't it?
fundamental. Yeah, that was the fundamental decision, and it's sort of like, well, close your bloody curtains, you know? I mean, and so, in the narrow streets and, I've lived in Madrid, in the narrow streets, it is a curtain game,
Yeah,
I'm at home, my curtain's open, I'm looking out, the neighbor is at home, their curtain's open, and they're sitting looking out. If they want some privacy, they close the curtain and they do
yeah,
whatever they're gonna do, and then you open the curtain again, and
yeah,
there's a connection between people, I mean, I lived in a street in Madrid that was actually only 6 meters wide,
yeah,
um, and 6 stories tall, so and interestingly, there's a guy who's done a video on, and I think it's in Phoenix, where he's built this little community that breaks all the rules of distance between units and width of street. His streets go down to 3 meters, and it's this little 2 to 4 story community, sort of community that's all walkable. And he likened it to Santorini. He wanted
yeah,
to emulate Santorini. Um, and it's super popular with the people that live there. I mean,
yeah.
incredibly popular,
But also
you
you're
know?
getting that connection. I'm just thinking of the vehicular street in, Lisbon,
Yeah,
and me and my
yeah,
partner was sat on our little
yeah,
Juliet balcony, and then, probably about 4 or 5 meters away, a
yeah,
guy barbecuing on his Juliet in his pants, and we were like, "Oh, good morning. Hello, how are you?" And but it's also like, when if we live there all the time, and that guy's quite often out on his balcony, then if you don't see him anymore, then you might go and check in on him and see if he's
yeah,
okay. It's like that.
yeah, yeah.
You don't need to have a long
Well, I think
conversation, but you still have a sort of connection.
I mean, this obsession started back in the sort of 1950s,
Yeah,
when they needed to build housing, they needed to set some kind of guidance, because prior to that, people just built what they could fit on the site and how
yeah,
tall they could build. And so, what led to kind of doing a lot of analysis on maybe how people should live and coming up some design guidance, then just became law.
yeah,
And literally 4,000 years of history was wiped off the table. And I started as an architect working in Glasgow with social housing, and before, the decade before I'd started working as an architect, they were demolishing all the tenements in Glasgow. because they were seen as substandard and they were putting up tower blocks, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and and there was a realization just when I started as an architect that maybe that's not a good idea, you know. Maybe the problem wasn't the tenement design itself. Maybe the problem was poverty, you know.
Well, yeah.
And so, and so they started to refurbish all the tenements and redo them internally. Super successful.
Yeah.
And from that point on, you look at Glasgow and all the tenements that were saved and not wiped away, and so it's yeah, I mean the whole kind of role of policy and regulation to kind of make people think in a very specific way is just crazy. And the fact that it's different in every single country gives the game away, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is no
There's
there's
no
no
perfect
universal
way.
solution. What
Yeah.
we want is variety, and we want the people want variety and they want difference.
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
and choice.
and choice,
Yeah. So
and yeah, so this whole sort of thing has always fascinated me. I mean, I grew up in a housing estate in Glasgow, a
yeah.
social housing estate in Glasgow. And I could see that the problem was not the design, the
Yeah.
problem was the management,
Yeah.
you know, the lack of funding, the lack of investment. And that's the fundamental thing and this is the biggest truth, I think, that, everybody should really think about, especially if you're an architect. Architects were blamed for the 60s, you
Yes.
know,
Yeah.
and they
It's
carried
it
that
still comes
sort of
up
guilt.
now.
And they carried that guilt. But the 60s wasn't a design problem, The 60s was a poverty problem and an investment problem by government into the social housing estates.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there were mistakes made, and some buildings were built to standards that didn't comply. But the fundamental thing was that the management was completely disconnected. The government thought they could build social housing and abandon it. You
Yeah.
know,
And because some
and
of
just
them
let
did have good things in them as well, like the shared laundry, the community spaces, and those were the
as I
spaces
say,
that
some were
actually
successful. I
yeah,
mean, you
and they
take
did have, good public realm until they concreted over them and let people just park all their cars there.
well, I mean, I lived in the Barbican,
Ah,
and
yeah.
I had friends who lived in Hutchestown. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
So Hutchestown was the kind of Barbican, the Glasgow Barbican equivalent, but it was social house. It was, I mean, the Barbican was originally social housing. Hutchestown was social housing. They demolished Hutchestown back in the 80s, I think,
yeah,
the early 80s. And the Barbican's been super successful, right?
yeah,
Very similar design principles, but the management is entirely different, you
yeah,
know?
yeah,
I
everything's
mean,
clean, it's maintained, and you have all the other facilities as
and
well,
it's
and the
very
gardens,
expensive to live there. It's
and it's
very
very
expensive. The
yeah,
service charge is enormous,
yeah,
and so this is what sort of gets me. It's like architects get blamed for kind of this design mistakes, or they're called mistakes, when actually it's a kind of social engineering mistake and a management error. And I think that's what really excited me about when Greystar arrived in the UK,
yeah,
because there wasn't a kind of institutional-led rental market. It was always housing associations, council housing, very few, and then the private rent sector. And everybody knew that the private rent sector was kind of struggling. If you've got a couple of apartments and you're only making a certain amount of rent and that's your only income because you're retired, you're not going to spend a massive amount of money doing those apartments up.
yeah, yeah.
And so you know, when Greystar came in everything clicked together. I
So was
knew that the
Greystar one
problem.
of the first build to rent, like the
Yeah, I
factory
think they were
build
one
to
of the
rent?
first that came
Okay,
into, and it's interesting because Greystar didn't sort of suddenly say, "Oh, we want to expand out of the US." They'd spent 25 years um, with investors from the UK, Canada, South America, Asia, Australia, investing in their product in the US. And those investors who were in those countries were the ones who said to Greystar, why don't you build outside of the US the same product? Because this is a great community product. And so it was actually the sort of local investors that kind of pulled Greystar out of the US into all of these different markets, which I think is amazing. But the whole idea, the thing that clicked for me was like I could see the problems of social housing, back in the 70s and the poor quality of management. And suddenly someone appears with a rental product that is really well managed and the
Yeah,
two are interlinked. And that's the big difference, is
yeah.
that
You can
the
see one that
level of,
works and one that doesn't.
and you see it spilling over now into for sale development. So most for sale development now has a much more sort of coherent, better management
Yeah,
strategy and
yeah,
structure,
yeah,
because the build to rent sector has come in and shown people how to do it.
yeah,
And I mean, I'm a big fan of housing associations, and if they were properly funded, then there's a massive amount of space in the market for housing associations to flourish.
yeah.
Um,
They need to
yeah,
sort of
I mean, I could talk about this stuff
yeah,
for
well, they
hours.
need to sort of sort out, the housing associations are sort of struggling at the moment, aren't they, in terms of funding because they're having to sort of go back to a lot of their, historical stock and sort it
Yeah.
out. But I think they're sort of coming through that now, and they are coming back into the market and starting to develop again, which is good to see. So, actually almost bringing all of that together
Mm.
with, with your sort of global hat on, and you've sort of seen there's problems in different countries, but maybe what other cities or, countries do you think are actually doing housing well? Are there any good examples?
Well, I think housing is getting done well everywhere.
Yeah,
Even in the UK, I remember someone said to me once, "Oh, housing is terrible in the UK." It's not. I mean, architects are designing really good housing and builders are building really good housing, and they're doing that everywhere. And I think that the problem is not that people aren't designing or building good housing, it's just the level of complexity and constraint that is placed on developers. And that is nowhere is it worse than the UK. I think the UK
okay.
has now hit the top tier of being the most difficult. I think Sydney in Australia is pretty close.
Okay.
Um, and so, but a lot of other sort of cities are pro-development. There isn't
Yeah,
this narrative that developers are bad. It's part of the process. They're delivering housing,
yeah,
and you know, I mean, one of the things that I think is good in the UK, a lot of people are opposed to it, is the whole viability assessment. I mean, but if it's done properly and fairly, then that's an incredibly powerful land value capture mechanism. Because if you think about it, the community who live around your site allow you to build 6 stories rather than 3. You know,
yeah, yeah,
you benefit from that. And so they should have some benefit as well. And I think that's where you have to kind of the viability assessment is really there to kind of capture that additional value that's added by the community,
mhm,
when they
mhm,
approve a particular approach, and so, and it's sort of very rare that that happens anywhere else in the world. There isn't a kind of land value capture mechanism. And I
yeah,
think it's a good thing, but it causes massive amounts of conflict and, it slows the entire process down. And I think the thing for me that's interesting, so when I joined Greystar in 2016, January 2016, so it's literally just been 10 years. Um,
congratulations.
I joined to work on this project out in Greenford.
Okay, yeah,
Uh, and, you know, I had been working for years. I worked with Argent at King's Cross, advising them on design. I worked with Canary Wharf, advising them on South Bank Place and Canary Wharf housing. And I worked with Bartley Homes. So I had a lot of experience working with all these different developers. Um, and then Greystar appears on the scene, and we had this opportunity to master plan a development. And so we brought in 5 architects, and we went to the council, and we said, basically, look, we want to have a meeting with you every single 2 weeks. We
yeah,
want to move at a fast pace, and we want to get approval quickly within 12 months. And we took that project, which had a consent for part of the site for 500 homes. Um, and within 6 months, we submitted a full detailed planning application for 2,000 apartments, 100,000 square foot of retail, 100,000 square foot of office, a new health centre, and a school. So we went from zero in the January to full detailed planning permission in the June, and
Yeah.
we got the detailed consent the following January. So in a
Okay.
12-month period, right? That's how the system should work, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Um, and that system only worked because there's one guy, Ealing, guy called Pat Hayes. You may have come across him.
Yes,
And
he
you're
was at the first for at one point.
sorry. Oh yeah, yeah.
He's
So you
first,
should get
yeah.
him on. You know, he pulled together the entire all the different groups within the cat, and he drove development in Ealing. That's why Ealing was super kind of progressive when it came to delivering housing.
Yeah.
Was because of the work of Pat Hayes and him sort of convincing the councils. And you need that, you know, you need that commitment and that drive within every single borough, you know. So
Yeah.
there's a kind of, it was a perfect marriage of institutional investors, you know, an institutional organization, you know, like Greystar development, investment, and operations. Some really sort of, you know, architects who knew housing really well, a really responsive planning group, and a super supportive committee that, you know, makes these things happen at speed. And that's what you need. And you needed that catalyst of Pat Hayes to kind of pull it all together. And for me, in my mind, that's how every development should go. And if it doesn't go like that, then there needs to be serious questions, you know, about, you know, why it's not progressing at the speed that it should, you know.
Yeah.
And so,
I think
and we
also
have,
that,
yeah,
like, feedback loop to, like, the local community of actually the benefits that development can have. 'Cause, interestingly, I was talking to Peter John yesterday, he was saying
yeah,
because of the regeneration and development and investment in Southwark, it brought in enough money to the council in terms of sort of additional, council tax, additional business
yeah,
rates, and also some of the jobs they did themselves also made money that then they were able to do free school meals for all kids in Southwark way before the Mayor of London was able to do it across the board. They were able
yeah,
to deliver free leisure centre and swimming to all the rest, you know, all these like thing and, you know, new
yeah,
libraries and all this kind of stuff, which other boroughs could never even dream of having, and they were able to do that because of the development that was
mm,
big that was going up in their area,
yeah.
and he said now there's people are forgetting that if you want all these other things, you do need to accept investment and development in your borough, and it can reap benefits to everybody else.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if I was running a borough in London, I would be, you know, you know, pulling in developers, you know, to look for
Yeah.
opportunities
Maybe
and
this is
work.
your next calling.
Well, and was yeah, no, I'm not sure I'm a politician, um, but you know, and it's really it's a partnership. You know,
Yeah,
when we're thinking about development, we're not just thinking about, oh, here's our project and here's the boundary of our project. I mean, our operations team are out talking to local businesses. They're having events in the community. They're inviting people from the community. It's, you know, it's like the tree roots, you know, going far into the community. I mean, because in the end, as I said, the fundamental mantra is, you know, a successful project is a successful community, you know, I mean, that's the mantra.
I mean, which country do you think is the easiest to work in at the moment, or city?
Oh, um, well, look, I mean, the US is traditionally far more open
Okay.
to sort of development. I mean,
Do you think
it's
the zoning that they have, the sort of zoning system for planning is part of the reason that makes it easier?
yeah, well, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, there's definitely advantages to it, and there's
Yeah.
disadvantages, you know.
Okay.
Um, Sometimes in the US, it depends state by state and even city by city. Sometimes the zoning is really just, look, here's the maximum height that you can
Yeah.
build on this site. Other times it's here's the maximum number of apartments, or here's the maximum floor area. Um, and I think where it works is when, you know, if you look at our planning system right now, we have all the pieces in place to make the system really efficient, right? We have a local plan where the planners can actually say, here's the maximum height you can build across this neighborhood. Um, and here's where you can go to a bigger height over here. That the local planners can discuss with the councils and the local community and
Yeah.
agree. And once that's agreed, there doesn't need to be any more consultation. if a developer goes in and looks at the local plan and it says the height of the buildings on that site are maxed out at 6 stories, and they stick within that. They play around with the building line. They don't control density. It's, they stick within that height because it's a broader, views from across that neighborhood or whatever it is that's restricting the height. If that's set and the use class is set for a site, so, if the council are desperate for residential and they zone it for residential, great. There's no other need for consultation. Councillors shouldn't be getting involved in the color of the brick
Yeah.
or the style of the windows on a building. That's totally irrelevant. What they want is they want the people living there, and they don't want the neighborhood, blocking out sunlight and, daylight, and they've got a restriction. So the only kind of restriction you really need is height. I mean,
Yeah.
you might argue that building line may be set back from here and set back from there, but height is really the main restriction and use. So if that was captured in the local plan, there would be no need for community consultation on anything because the community know, they've agreed it's going to be residential.
Yeah.
They know that the height is going to be X, Y. That's it,
Yeah.
and then it's about utilizing the outline planning consent so that a developer can go with a very rough idea of what the massing might look like on a site and get approval for that
Yeah.
particular massing on the site. And once that's done, because all of this is like the whole planning system, the BSR, they all increase risk, and
And that's
risk
the big one,
requires
isn't it? Because
investment.
the profit
And risk
margins are actually not that big.
It's risk. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like risk deters investment. That's why you've seen a complete collapse in the delivery of housing since the introduction of the BSR, because it's
Yeah.
introduced a massive level of risk. So if you had a planning system where it was defined in the local plan, very few parameters that the community and the councillors could agree on, and then every developer who comes along can just go in and get an outline consent very quickly. I'm talking like within 6 weeks they can submit something and get a decision that de-risks the development. And then the detailed consent is something that you empower the planning
Yeah.
officers to grant that detailed consent. I mean, they're trained specialists.
Yeah.
And and
Yeah.
the and the problem is that all too often is that at the detailed consent level, it becomes a political battle,
Yeah.
you know.
I
And
agree that that is a problem. I actually do think we need to depoliticize it.
yeah, no, I mean, I've been in the council room at the
Oh.
committee, and everyone around the table loves the scheme, and yet the Labour side of the council voted the opposite direction to the Conservative side of the council because they
Yeah.
had been primed beforehand, you know, even though it was an amazing project. And it's a oh it's a puppet show, or it's a play.
Yeah.
It's all pre-scripted for.
Yeah.
The whole
Yeah.
thing is an absolute pantomime. And that's where, we need to trust our planning officers to make these decisions.
Yeah. And
And the fact is,
employ more as well. Employ more planning
yeah.
officers. Maybe
Well,
pay
the
them
funny thing
more as
is,
well.
if you changed the system to this streamlined system using
Yeah.
all the things we have in place, you wouldn't need more planning officers because the planning
Yeah,
officers
true.
wouldn't be having, councillors breathing down the neck and trying to overturn decisions. I was on a podcast before, and I said it is like, dealing with the planning system and the regulatory system in the UK is like being in a Monty Python movie. You know,
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
it
quite
is
true.
kind of ridiculous. You know,
And also the other
um,
challenge is, I think there's also concern that reform might take quite a lot of councils across the country. And whilst
yeah.
they are on paper supposedly libertarians, they're actually
Mm.
running on total do not build tickets across the board. So I
Yeah,
think there's a
yeah.
bit of let's hope they don't take any councils.
I
I'm
think,
not
look,
assuming you're the way that you vote, but
yeah, yeah.
but anyway.
No, but look, I mean, look, I think it's a kind of conscious decision that the government need to make in
Yeah.
order to streamline the process. And I think maybe the problem has been that the technology hasn't been there and before, but the technology is definitely there now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
New South Wales government in Australia embarked on digitizing all of the sort of, the whole of New South Wales into a map called Land IQ,
Okay.
where everyone could access it. All of the data was there.
So
You
it's a bit
could
like our View City.
Well, it was open. I mean, it's like a council, it's like a government sort of way of managing. They've digitized their internal, so and each part of the government can talk to each other
Oh,
within
okay.
the system. It was developed by Giraffe, who are a company that we're using, and WSP for the New South Wales government. And they're probably the most progressive, partly because they've got one of the biggest problems. I mean, Sydney average for sale costs in Sydney are 20 times average salary. I think in London it's 12, and
Yeah.
so there's a massive problem in Sydney in terms of
Yeah.
affordability. And this is what it all comes down to is affordability. But they have digitized and gone with, they've created their own platform that could easily be kind of adopted across the globe now that it's been established. And I think that's where, you know, the government should be looking at, well, how can technology sort of help us streamline the process? And I'm sure they are, but I
Yeah.
don't know if they've got the right people looking at it, because the problem is like consultants and government sort of go hand in hand. The consultants are advising government so that the result of policy can generate income for the consultant.
Well, yeah,
You
make
know,
things more
Uh,
complicated. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
make things more complicated. They can set up a
Mm.
sideline business. So the people advising the government on BSR are now setting up businesses advising developers and consultants on BSR submissions. I
How
mean,
to, like, navigate the complete dark world of BSR
it,
that no one understand yeah.
yeah, I mean, but it's yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's astounding that this stuff happens. I mean, it's unbelievable. It wouldn't
I think
happen in a
procurement's
normal
the
business.
same as well. I think procurement's quite similar.
Procurement. Oh
Ye
yeah, no, I mean, like, I mean, the systems and processes that government set up. I mean, there is an element of the technology that's coming in now that, I'm kind of optimistic that it's going to enable us to kind of streamline government
Yeah.
as much as it is businesses, and it's going to enable the government to kind of make less personal driven decisions and more kind of data driven decisions,
Yeah. Yeah.
and drive maybe hopefully a level of transparency, through the technology piece. And so I'm pretty optimistic about the whole kind of advent of AI, and the development of kind of algorithmic thinking, let's say, which is kind of hand in hand to the large language model sort of methods, and bringing them together, I think is going to be pretty powerful. And I see sort of the role of our team as to kind of try and lead the way in that process, and we're working right now with a group of architects in the UK to streamline the process. And we're proving the point. We can go from um, finding a site, looking at a site on a Monday, to being ready for a pre-app with a full 3D walkthrough model by the Friday. You know,
Yeah. And is it
that's the speed we can now move at. And that's what we're kind of driving amongst the teams. And it's not that we're doing less work. It's just you're working a hell of a lot smarter, and you're
yeah.
leveraging technology to kind of speed those things up.
Yeah, and I suppose taking yeah, speeding up some elements which enables you to do more thinking time in the elements that still require that sort of the human touch and the human way of thinking.
Exactly. I mean, I years ago, I worked at a big architecture practice where there was one guy there, and his job all day, every day, was to lay out car parks. He was a
Yeah.
qualified architect, but he was the specialist at laying out car parks. No one wants to be that guy,
No,
you
this
know.
is true. But
If
I mean, the first thing I did
technology,
in a practice was redlining with a pen because we
yeah,
didn't have a colour printer.
yeah. I mean, technology is coming in to make these things just seem totally ridiculous. I
Yeah.
did a I did a talk at a conference in Germany, and it was to a whole group of engineers. And I sort of set out what I thought was kind of, or how we've been thinking about how the future might develop. And it is this idea that, at the moment, there's just a sort of word cloud of consultants involved in the entire process. I mean, the number of consultants involved in any project is just staggering. And I think that's partly the fault of architects advising government about design policy and
Yeah.
regulation that requires more and more and more reports. And so, you know, it's a stick that the architects have made for their own back. But basically, we've got this kind of word cloud of consultants. And, in the end, when you strip it back, you need an investor, you need a landowner, you need someone who's creative, who's going to create the environment, which hopefully is the
I was gonna say,
architect and
let's
not
hope it's
an
the
AI.
architects.
And we can come back to that. It could be AI, it could be an architect. You need the contractor and the end user. And then somewhere in that is either at the beginning, not part of the process because the community's decided that site is already earmarked for residential and it can be 6 stories tall, right?
Yeah.
So they're not even in that equation, you know. And so they've already decided that's the parameters. And so there's 5 people that need to be in the process.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so everybody else is replaceable. Everyone else is replaceable. And so I'm saying this to this room full of structural engineers, mechanical engineers, service engineers, technology guys. And I said, the wonderful thing is that, you're all going to be unemployed
Okay.
and
Yeah.
you're going to, and your brains are going to be completely freed to go do stuff that's much more interesting than the mundane stuff you're doing right now.
This
If your
yeah.
job can be replaced by AI, then you shouldn't be wanting to do that job, you know?
I
I
think that
mean,
is quite a good I think a good mantra, as long as there is still funding to do and we still invest in the more creative,
well,
because I think we need to have value with the creative thinking and the human mind.
this is where I think there's a massive boom is going to happen because you're going to free up a bunch of incredibly intelligent, well-organized people to
Yeah.
go do other things, right? They're not going to be doing the mundane stuff that
They're
they've
not gonna be
been doing
designing
for
car parks.
years. They're not going to be laying out car parks. The
Yeah, yeah.
potential is now free to go. And I think we're going to see a massive boom in productivity. It's a new kind of industrial revolution. The industrial revolution freed an entire group of people who would have been sort of, on the fields to go do something more interesting, you know.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's what the explosion was. And I think that's the really fascinating thing about the whole kind of AI and leveraging technology to streamline stuff. And then if you go back to the creative side, when you look at those 5 people, who's the one that kind of links them all together? It's the architect because people invest in a narrative,
Yeah, and
communities
storytelling.
invest in a narrative, and
Yeah.
architects are storytellers.
Yeah,
Whether they're using an algorithm to auto-generate the design, they're like a curator and a storyteller,
yeah.
and so that's the power of having, I mean, I c you can sit down and bang away at a guitar and make noise, but it's not gonna be music necessarily. But you take a musician and, you run an algorithm, or he plays the guitar, then, they've got the skill set in order to use the instrument. If you take AI and you're a random person just generating odd buildings, and sort of saying, yeah, we could build that here and build that there, then it's the same kind of thing as just bashing on a guitar.
Yeah,
It's like
you need a good editor and that other the way of bringing it together.
exactly
I
as a
mean, how
curator.
do we and how do we as a profession, 'cause you have, been quite critical of the profession, I think quite rightly, that we have, like, let a lot of our function go. How do we make sure that us as a profession actually do embrace this and do it well and stay relevant, do you think?
Well, I think what's interesting. I mean, there's the architectural education system, which some schools are actually very good at delivering some architects that are good designers and well-rounded, and
Yeah,
other
yeah,
schools are great at producing set designers,
yeah,
and
yeah,
computer animators. And that's fine. I mean, I studied with a guy at university who studied architecture for to degree level, and then went off into the computer animation industry,
Yeah, yeah,
um, and that's fine because you learn the sensibilities of space and and interactions with space, and so the g- education has to kind of respond to what technology is going to be doing, and it has to kind of encourage students to leverage that technology. And I think the strongest sort of position that we can get ourselves into as architects is to reskill in the basics of kind of project management, structural engineering, service engineering, all of the professions that have become their own thing. We need a very, very light refresh on skills on those things because in the end, those things are all going to be done by sort of algorithms and LLMs, and you need to be able to understand whether what it's outputting is right, you know.
yeah,
And so, and unless you rescale and get those kind of basics right, then it's very difficult to kind of get a feel for what should be right and what maybe isn't right, And LLMs and algorithms are going to get better and better, and there's systems already out there for automating structural engineering and
yeah.
service engineering. And so I would say that, the architects need to become a little bit more well-rounded, and in the end, if an assistant level, let's say algorithm AI product, is working alongside of you, doing the project management piece, doing the structural engineering and service engineering, responsive to what you're doing as a designer, that's the perfect combination.
Yeah, and then you've actually got more, I suppose, control over it as well. I mean, I find particularly with,
Well,
like,
the other,
project
yeah.
management, the way that it separates me from the client, I
Oh
find
no,
quite frustrating because
but
I actually like to have that relationship with the client and have those conversations. I mean, this is what I love about projects on site, and the sort of relationship you form with your site manager is
yeah,
so important. If you've got someone in the way of that,
yeah,
but actually,
exactly.
once you get to site, that the sort of project manager goes to one side, and you do have that relationship, you can just get things done, and it's so
Yeah.
much better, I think.
No, there should never be a project manager between a client um, and an architect. But no, I mean, I think so. What's really interesting, so we've been testing, or we're now working with this with Giraffe, which is this software, and we've built our construction costs into it. We've built our operational costs. We've built our development model. And so every box that the architect draws, the architect sees what it does to the value of the project, right? Because what we're trying to do is sort of empower the architect.
And we can
So
creatively respond.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's the most exciting time to be an architect. Actually,
Yeah.
I
So
had a
rather than
young
burying our heads in the sand, we need
Well,
to
I had a
embrace it.
young architecture student who was just finishing a degree, and they contacted me and they said, I can't see a future in architecture. What should I switch to development or another profession, or what should I do? And I sort of wrote back to him and explained to him that I thought this was like the most exciting time to be an architect, because it is going to, it's going to be last man standing, you know. And the last man standing is not going to be an algorithm
No,
telling a
true.
story to a
Yeah.
community, you know.
Yeah.
And
Well,
yeah,
let's hope.
yeah. No, I mean, I think architects are in the perfect position
Mm.
to assume that role, but they have to grab it with both hands. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's the important thing, is to really kind of you know get an understanding of what's happening in technology, and we're trying to kind of pilot an idea for how we can unlock housing in the UK.
Yeah.
Um, and actually, it's all looking pretty good. And so, we're sort of working really closely with a group of architects, kind of developing this whole strategy. And I think, it's going to be successful at sort of unlocking value.
I am liking your optimism, particularly for architects, but also for housing in the UK, because obviously I think the actual market, I suppose, backtracking back to the market, it has been quite stifled over the past couple of years. And I think, I mean, we've,
Yeah.
in terms of like what you would say to government, we've already said I think you said technology, streamlining the planning system, sort out BSR. Are there any other levers that you think that should be pulled to try and get things moving?
Well, I think, the big one is, Brexit caused an exodus of
Yeah,
skilled labor, you
yeah,
know. And we're also it's like a perfect storm really, because we're coming to the point now where a lot of people who are tradespeople are coming up for retirement, you know.
yeah, yeah,
They're all in the kind of 50s, and they've all sort of probably paid off their mortgages by now. They're maybe thinking about early retirement. They're in their 50s and their 60s. These are the generation who kind of, when they left school, getting a trade like an electrician or a plumber or, was actually part of, just what you did.
yeah,
It's how
yeah.
I left school. I mean, when I left school, my goal was to become an electrician, you know.
Ah, okay.
And I fell into architecture completely by accident, and so, you know, it's like the kids used to leave school with that as the basis of, what they would build a life on,
Yeah,
and I just can't get my head around what kids are thinking now when they're leaving school. I
yeah,
don't know if they're thinking that they can easily become a superstar TikToker and make lots of money, and they're gonna waste the next 10 years playing in that field
yeah,
to realize that only a few people make it. And hopefully, sort of kids who are leaving school now kind of understand that layer at the top is a very thin layer,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that if you wanna build a life for yourself, it's a long-term game. It's not a sort of a quick win,
And you can
and
change
getting.
careers over time. I think the
Yeah,
way
yeah,
that my
and
dad
it's
did it,
and
where
it
he had one career forever, is very
yeah,
different. So,
and
but
it's
all those
fun.
skills you build, yeah, all those skills you build along the way
Yeah,
actually help get you into a certain
yeah,
direction. I mean, I don't know whether you agree, but I also think that with the world of I do still think the kind of craft and hand skills are actually still gonna be vitally important with the
oh, yeah,
creativity, particularly when it comes to retrofit. I think it's still
yeah,
gonna be phenomenally expensive to get a robot to do retrofit construction. I think we're gonna
yeah,
be retrofitting historic buildings for much longer than we might be using factories and robots to build new builds, but I think
yeah.
there's
Well,
still
there's
gonna
nothing
require.
better there's nothing better than using your hands to do something.
Exactly.
I mean, back sort of 20 years ago, I bought myself an old rundown motorcycle, and I rebuilt it from scratch, um, and just that process was just amazing. I mean,
Yeah,
it's like, the was it Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance or whatever. It was amazing. I mean, the part of the problem was when I rebuilt it, I'd missed a couple of pieces and had to put it into the garage for them to fix it, but we can gloss over that. But
you've still got a bit of satisfaction. Yeah,
but it was the process. It was the process, and it ended up, being a great motorcycle. And so, that whole kind of working with your hands, I think, is becoming so even more important now that the kind of admin roles are being kind of consumed by sort of language models and all of these other kind of technology pieces.
yeah,
And so, yeah, I mean, I think that is interesting. I mean, there was a guy posted on LinkedIn, I think about 2 years ago, and he had a hand drawn sketch, and he was like, "Oh, this is probably my last sketch because Midjourney is all going to replace us." And I took his sketch and I put it into Midjourney and created a 3D world from it, or like a 3D sort of computer model visual. Um, and I reposted it back on his chat, and I said, "No, no, sketching is the most powerful thing,
yes,
because now I can do a sketch, and technology can take that sketch and build it into a 3D model with a full construction detail
yeah,
set." So, yeah, I mean, it's made a massive difference, I think, to everybody's life,
yeah,
who's using it. And we're, you can run a very quick feasibility study just by feeding in the basic parameters into ChatGPT without knowing anything really about the market that you're dealing with or the
yeah,
product that you're building or and you can get some intelligent answers back. I mean, it's not going to get rid of the sort of, uh, the fundamental kind of decision making that you have to make when you make it real and you're dealing with real money. Although I do hear that one company has set up ChatGPT as its CEO, and so
okay.
all decisions go to the CEO and then are fed back out and discussed and debated, you
So
know?
even CEOs are at risk. Wow.
Yeah, yeah, even CEOs. I mean, I think for me, the amazing thing with Greystar was that we did a deal with OpenAI to give access to 500 people within the business
Okay.
to a completely self-contained environment, so not connected to the public
Yeah.
OpenAI model. For us to, as a playground, to kind of experiment with ideas and play around with ideas. And, that has been across the business in design and construction and the development, investment, operations. And so the ideas that are coming out of that are now kind of starting to be implemented, I mean, it's crazy,
Well, it's quite
that,
exciting actually.
that people who are, working in one role can have some thoughts and ideas and test things about another role and then sort of send it to the person who does that role and sort of says, "Oh yeah, this is what this is. Oh yeah, okay," and you can start to kind of see that, you know, it's not AI is going to come into your office and take everyone's jobs. It's actually, integrating AI into workflows is sort of, for me, I think a lot of people jump the gun by letting people go. I think it's the fact that it's going to enable a lot more depth of analysis. When I
Yeah.
think back to, when I was on the drawing board doing hand-drawn drawings, and I was a young guy at the time, and all the older guys, CAD came in, and they were like, "Oh, it's the end of our job," you know? Sort of like, well, we didn't sort of all sort of cut the amount of work that we did. We're not all doing 1 day a week, you know?
No, we're
What
doing
we
more.
did was we did the work in a far more depth, you know?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
now we're able to produce I mean, if you think about it, 30 years ago, a freehand sketch someone could do quite quickly and color it, and they could do a freehand set of plans and stuff. Well, now it's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that you're able to have the same speed at doing that with
yeah.
3D models,
That is
and
true.
create the entire environments, and so, what we've done over the last 30 years is dig in more and more and more detail into what we're building, what we're
I mean,
delivering.
you've by the time a project gets to site now, you've worked out
Yeah,
every single junction pretty much because the whole
yeah,
thing has been built. And I mean, I remember when we started working in Revit, it was like you were finding junctions and working them out that you didn't even know existed when you were just
yeah.
working in 2D. But I suppose one thing what as a profession we failed to do was take more money for that because it did save contractors a lot of time on site.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
In
there
the
is
end,
an argument for that,
we weren't so
but I
good at
think at the
that,
same
I don't
time
think.
though, there's a sort of, you know, architects are very good at, the design side of things, um, but you're even better as an architect if you've been on site and built stuff.
Yes,
And
yeah,
so, if you speak to people who are on site and you learn from them, and again, that's part of the reskilling, it's like
yeah,
architects really need to go work on a building site for a few years, as part of the learning process to see how things are put together.
yeah,
And so having a combination, and that's why, the architect and the contractor as being the two linchpins of the process in the future,
yeah,
that dialogue between them and learning and sort of the feedback loop is essential,
yeah.
and I
That's
think
always been
that's what.
my favourite bit.
Yeah, yeah, for
That we need
sure,
to get more projects to get on site because there's definitely everything's a bit, slow going at the moment, but going to be I think now we've sort of gotten through Building Safety Act, it's still there, but
I
and
hope it's gonna clear, I mean,
I think
I
so.
hope that backlog is gonna clear
And
in
with
the
that, are you on the projects you are any projects going forward, are you gonna stay below the 18-meter line?
Yeah, we're not looking at any new build projects above, 18 meters,
So as a
and
percentage,
that.
that's quite a lot less homes that could be delivered
Well,
as a result.
I was asked once, what's the impact on developers of, the BSR and the sort of 18-meter rule? And I said, there's zero impact unless
Yeah,
you own a site
yeah,
that's already got consent, and
yeah,
well, and you've got consent, you don't need to worry about it. But unless you've just recently bought a site, then it has no impact. The impact it has is on the delivery of housing in
yeah.
these boroughs
So you're
and the
gonna get less
density that can be achieved. That's the impact of it.
yeah.
I mean, developers will go where they can build and where investors are prepared to invest money, you know? And so, that's, I mean, the critical thing I think that UK government needs to do is to figure out ways of encouraging investment
Yes.
into the market for housing, for everything really, because you know the government can pay for all the housing if it wants, but that means borrowing a ton of money and raising everyone's taxes. You
Yeah.
know, so you're better to actually encourage investors to come in, allow them to make a profit, and benefit from the the investment in a borough or a town or a village or whatever,
Which goes
because
back
you're
to what
going
we
to
were
get
saying earlier, there is evidence that that does benefit everybody.
yeah, well, you're going to get your tax receipts from income of all the people moving in. You're going to get your sales receipts, sales tax and buying tax from, trading land and buying and selling apartments. You get your income tax from the profits that generated by the buildings that are rented. And so there's a massive amount of contribution and tax that developers make and investors make when they decide to invest. So it's sort of like the government benefit in ways that are not just about delivering affordable homes. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like there's a massive amount of benefits beyond that.
So
So
so maybe like going to the last question, with all of that in mind, are you optimistic for the future in terms of development in the UK?
um, yeah, look, I mean, I think things have to change. We
Yeah.
can't go on. We've got to make concessions. We've got to make changes that enable, that encourage people to invest in the UK. I mean, that's the fundamental problem at the moment, is all of the regulation has resulted in investors just becoming very nervous about timescales and risk and everything else.
So
And
do
I
you think
think
it is actually looking at that regulation is the key thing to try to encourage more investment?
yeah, I mean, regulation, red tape, being reasonable, not politicizing things,
Yeah.
and getting the politics out of it. I mean, the biggest thing the UK could do is to have a cross-party group appoint a housing czar
Yeah.
that will last longer than the government. Yeah, that that is actually going to. 'Cause, I mean, you look at a development cycle. Development cycle is 4 to 5 years, the same as a government length. You know, and so by the time you get a site and you've delivered it and people are moving in, that government's come and gone.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and what we need is consistency. What investors like is actually consistent. Consistency over time.
Mm.
So if you had a sort of proactive, and I hate to say minister, housing minister, because you've had like 20 of them in 10 years, you know, but you need a cross-party kind of group who are focused on delivering housing. And it's not, the communities and local government group, and it's not, it needs to be, a group whose focus is on making sure that, there's no bottlenecks.
Yeah, and I suppose that adds
And
in wider infrastructure into that as well, because the sort of stop-start of big
oh,
infrastructure projects. I
oh
mean
my,
I
we could
mean
talk about infrastructure for
I
for
mean,
days because
being where
you
I
know,
am right now, the Bakerloo has been, and I did talk about this yesterday again with Peter John, but the Bakerloo has been one where all of those sites along the Old Kent Road,
yeah.
no one's developing them because the Bakerloo line got paused.
Yeah, yeah, but also, there's an entire area of West London that doesn't have power, that's
Yeah.
ripe for development and
That
doesn't have
wow,
enough
okay.
capacity.
Yeah,
I mean, we're talking about 5,000 homes in West
yeah,
London, but there's not enough power to actually power the homes. I mean, the government made a fundamental mistake 30 years ago in deciding that they wouldn't invest in infrastructure and energy, and that
yeah,
they would push the responsibility for saving energy onto the development world, you know, the development and construction world. And so heavier and heavier regulation came in to stop people from using energy by and we're at the point now where we're insulating buildings so much that we're having to put cooling in. I
yeah,
mean, how ridiculous is
yeah.
that? How ridiculous is
And
that?
there's also
You
like the
insulate
carbon as well. There must be a sort of, 80/20 principle that extra bit, yes, it's saving you more in terms of energy, but the embodied carbon in that as well is quite
yeah,
a lot. There must be a
yeah.
sort of a balance or
Yeah, I mean, there's a level of madness that exists, and it's a it's an echo chamber that a lot of people live in
yeah,
that just keeps growing and growing and growing and consuming everything, and that echo chamber has now reached the point where it's consumed the entire housing industry
yeah.
in the
Because I always
southeast
wonder, would it not be better
of
to,
London.
yes, still have really good, insulated new builds still to a certain level, but
Yeah.
maybe don't quite go as far as passive house, but that developer then invests in a pot that then that borough can then just put roof insulation in a ton of homes, and you probably save more energy.
Yeah, well, like, there's a massive number of ways of doing it, but I think the fundamental problem is that the government didn't invest in energy 30 years ago,
Yeah,
and UK now has the highest energy costs in the world,
yeah,
the
yeah,
highest in the world, you know? I mean, that's just mind-blowing,
yeah,
that we've put ourselves in that position over the last, and it's not just one government, it's just a failure of every successive government to invest in energy infrastructure,
we also had
you
the
know?
issue of back to planning with with wind farms on the coast that then it was brought back to councils to decide. I
Yeah,
think that's of
yeah.
national importance. Like, we're an island, it makes
I
so
mean,
much.
it's crazy, I mean, but look, I mean, the government need to kind of like really wake up and really shake up the whole approach. And it's not this government's problem. It's not the last government's problem. It's kind of it's the whole method that the government use to develop policy and drive it through
Yeah.
year on year. Just needs to be rethought.
So we
You
need
know,
that, like, almost like you say, that cross-party long-term vision because
view
projects are
exactly.
long-term, whether
Yeah,
they be infrastructure
exactly.
or housing, but then
Yeah,
so that kind of then almost takes the risk level and uncertainty out because you've got this sort of it's part of the national interests, a cross-party group that are sort of driving
exactly.
that agenda. It's like, I suppose, long-term vision plans for local councils. It's like, well, if you know what the vision plan is, then everyone
Yeah.
feeds back into that no matter what colour, political party they are, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that sort of think tank or whatever it is needs to strip away all the ridiculousness of the policy. I mean,
Yeah.
one thing I can't get my head around right now is, let's say I'm 40 years old, single, living in London. I can rent an 18 square meter apartment in a co-living
Yeah,
development
yeah,
that has a bit of amenity space, and I paid 900 a month or whatever. Or I could rent a shared apartment, a shared room. Um, but where I can't rent is I can't rent in a normal residential building, you know? The minimum floor area for an apartment in the London plan and national design is 37 square meters, you know? So you've got this sort of schism where people who are living in the co-living block, I think it's 18 square meters is the minimum unit. And if you're 18
yeah,
square meters, you have to provide 5 square meters of amenity per unit. So you're
yeah,
effectively renting 23 square meters, right?
yeah, yeah,
So I'm renting 23 square meters, but I'm excluded from living in a normal building because 23 square meter apartments can't be incorporated into normal housing. And
yeah.
so that's where the whole schism happens
So you're not
between,
gonna meet all those other people.
yeah, I
You're
mean,
not
look,
gonna meet
it's very,
the
yeah,
older person or
yeah.
or, you know.
I mean, it's created a sort of apartheid system, where you've got one building type is like, oh, they can only live in that building, and they've got their 18 square meter apartments. And now you've got the general housing group that has, and so this is where policy just kind of falls apart, really,
Mm.
and that's the kind of ridiculousness of it all.
Yeah, so it almost brings back to what you were saying at the beginning. It's almost like summarizing our conversation. It's like we need
Mm,
to think about all the different ways that we might want to live and
yeah,
almost adapt the regulation or shift the regulation or just make it guidance so that we can actually design and test these different ways of living, whether it be mixing small with larger developments or mixing up space standards, because like you say, it's different across all countries.
yeah,
Obviously sort out Building Safety Act, innovate both within how our sort of the consultant side of things need to innovate and and the architecture profession, but also in terms of actually the types of buildings that we're building. Is that what we're saying? And construction skills and planning,
yeah.
depoliticized planning. What did I miss?
Yeah, there's a long list,
There was quite a
but,
long list.
But there's, I mean, like, it's an interesting thing. Part of the hope of new technology and AI is that you could feed it all of the documentation that government use,
Yeah,
and it could strip out all the rubbish, you
and
know,
all
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 the
the, wait,
all the
contradicts.
meaningless stuff, all
Yeah,
the red tape,
yeah,
and maybe come back with something that's much simpler and much more
yeah,
succinct, and I think that would be the ultimate goal, beyond, letting AI take over the government, which it would have its own dangers, but, I think as architects, we've got an opportunity to grab what's going on in technology and to drive it, not to kind of just be, oh, they're doing this and they're doing that, but to get involved in the direction that it's going, And so, and that's why, we're keen to kind of work with architects and develop processes. And then we're feeding that back to the software companies and
yeah.
saying, here's the processes that we've been looking at. How could we even streamline these further? So we're working directly with the software companies to try and streamline the process even more. And so it's not about sort of just being responsive and grabbing the tools, but it's then about sort of, well, how can you push the tools? And, I've been talking to a few people recently who are not computer programmers, and they've been writing little bits of software just
Wow.
using
Yeah.
Claude code, and implementing it, and
Wow.
that's where, the power is really in your own hands, I mean, it doesn't take much to kind of, code something now, if you wanted to create, an app or whatever you want to do. And I think that's where the creativity side of it is starting to kind of appear. Those engineers that have been, that won't exist in 10 years, let's say. I mean, there'll still be some of them around, but
The good
um,
one.
yeah, the good ones will probably leave, and they'll use the technology to develop whole new ways of thinking and
Yeah,
product making, and I think that's where we're going to see some interesting stuff
yeah.
happening. Um,
I think
and I
I think
think,
that I was gonna say, I
yeah,
think that sounds exciting, and I think I've always been quite nervous, but I think it is definitely that, as you're saying, it's the architect's moment. I think maybe this is maybe cause to be optimistic as long as we actually take the opportunity rather than burying our heads in the sand and letting it go.
yeah, I mean, like, this thing's not going to happen overnight. So, you could be an architect and, work the normal way. I have a friend who um, lives in Ireland. He still draws on his drawing board, and he just does one-off houses, house extensions. He's been doing that for the last 15 years. Um, and he makes a great living out of it, and he really enjoys it, and he loves drawing, and so, it's horses for courses, as they say. I mean, it's sort of, if you wanna be involved and you wanna be engaged and you wanna sort of push the technology, then jump in and grab it. But that doesn't mean to say you don't have to, there's still gonna be a 10-year probably transition period, of change, or 5-year, who knows really, but there's definitely change coming, what that change is, we'll kind of find out as we're going along. But if you can influence that change by kind of getting involved, then I think that's sort of the exciting part.
That's brilliant. I think that is the perfect way to end. That's